but I wanted to just say what it is that we're doing up at the top, right? So we're going to do a little bit of background on Cassatt because she's such a great glimpse into looking into Paris. I mean, ironically, right? So here's this woman who is an outsider, a non-native at least, and then she becomes an insider, joins up with the Impressionists, but I think gives us a really interesting angle into looking at Paris. And then I'm going to land us with some takeaway questions, such that if you can't take the class or if you are taking the class, these are some questions that you can walk around with, sort of tuck it in with your fanny pack, as far as what you're looking at. I mean, you can actually use these in all the other kinds of cities that you go and visit, but I think particularly in Paris with the paintings that you might see if they're modern. Just to ask some of the questions that I'm going to raise here. And I think it helps raise your engagement and not getting bored like, oh, it's another picture of a, naked lady or something like that, So that's kind of how we're going to do it. All right. So, okay. So again, this is the information on Mary Cassatt. It's got two different names as far as the painting goes. In the Loge, and for those of you who had to look it up like me, that's this kind of box seating, this balcony seating. And at the Française is, that was the original, one of the original titles that it got. And that was the Comédie Française. It's one of the oldest theater troupes in Europe and definitely in France. Okay, so they are looking, we're looking here at a lot of looking. Right? And this is something I really want to follow up on, the seeing and being seen. And how can we think about this in complicated ways? Because obviously, right, visual art is about seeing. So you might be asking, well, I mean, why particularly we're looking at it in this modern time in this particular city? And while I can't explain all of that today, we'll certainly get a sneak peek into that. Okay. So here we are, we're looking at Cassatt. This is a self-portrait. Those are the birth dates right there. And she was born in Philly, did her training in Philadelphia, and then really felt just like a lot of her compatriots in America, that her artistic training just wasn't complete without going to Europe. So she, just like a lot of Americans, American artists, in a way kind of finished their schooling, or at least continued their schooling in Europe. And so Cassatt was one of those folks, but she actually settled. She decided to settle in 1874. And then just as a little date as far as understanding how quickly she got into the society there, in 1877, Degas, the famous Impressionist painter, invited her to participate in one of the Impressionist exhibitions, which is very impressive. She got into what is essentially a boys' club, right? Very quickly. And she almost immediately really kind of rejected the much more stuffy academic kind of painting. This was the official, connected to the government type of painting. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that too in the class. All right, so I've introduced our painter here. But I also wanted to have you all take a look at just this idea of looking. So I thought you might want to see the actual, it's still standing, this building, what it looks like on the inside. So we have two photographs here in the middle and on the left. And so basically, if you can see, I'm almost trying to wrap the balcony all the way around. But this is actually an indication, like why are people doing a lot of this, people looking at one another, these public spaces? This is an increased fascination in painting public spaces, and particularly people glancing at one another, seeing one another out and about, okay? It's not just looking at Louis XIV or someone in a historic special event, right? It's ordinary or middle-class people, actually, I should say more for real, looking at one another and portraying one another here. So, for instance, this is not Cassatt, but this is Renoir. And this is one of these essentially open spaces in Paris that we're going to study more on the actual day of Paris. But I wanted to show you the kinds of things that you see. We're just in the mix here of seeing and being seen, right? People are just looking at one another, this couple looking at us, and so on and so forth, right? But also, not only are we talking about actually physically looking at one another. Have I frozen? Are you guys hearing me here? Oh,
I can
I'm back.
hear you.
Sorry about that. I don't know why I'm getting a little bit frozen here, but not only are they interested in physically looking at one another, there's just this real preoccupation with what the eye does and what it can't do. So here's this very sort of strange centering of the eyeball here, that there's the powers of the eyeball are being expanded as far as what we're looking at as painters, or at least I think that that's what the modern painters would argue, to the degree that actually art might even be painted by those who in a way are not using what their actual eyeballs, they're using something deeper, right? And so while we won't get into abstract painting really in this, we did it in the modern art class, I wanted you to just see this preoccupation with literal seeing and then also the inner eye of seeing. But let's be a little bit more literal here. And I want us to think and identify maybe just these at least 3 viewers who are actively looking here in this Cassatt painting. And so if you want, you can just unmute yourself and share, or go ahead and share in the chat. So maybe if everybody could just do one, that would be great. Or not everybody, anyone, just identifying one of the viewers.
I like the man in the far booth looking at this gal.
Right. Yeah. That is certainly curious. Right. Yeah. So he's looking at the gal in the booth. Right. And just so you know,
it looks like he's sharing his view between his companion and this woman, like he's looking at both of them.
Okay. So so this guy is looking at her and maybe the person who's in our seat, like over on this side. Is that what you're saying, Mark? Okay. Yeah. And in fact, I meant to jump in, but this is Cassatt's sister. So she's sharing, whoever the person who's viewing this is sharing that booth with her. Oops. And I kind of gave up another viewer. Anyone else? Who are the other views? So obviously we've got this woman who's looking out at something.
I think the most interesting one, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
Miss Mary, is and I apologize for my camera situation. Anyway, the woman sitting next to the man looking at the other woman, it's unclear what she's looking at, but I'm kind of thinking she's looking at him.
This one right here?
Looking at someone else, the one next to the man.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. And you can kind of tell, I mean, it's amazing what she does with just a few dabs of paint, right? That she has some sort of direction. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sort of evokes.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else want to jump in? Looks like someone's on the chat here. The artist, is that what you're saying, Leslie? Yeah, right.
Yes, the artist is very carefully and actively looking at the people around him.
Right. So the one who created this is actively looking. Yeah. Yeah. And I hadn't even thought, that's so great. I hadn't thought about this. I knew that you all would come up with things I hadn't thought about. I would add another third is the viewer of this object. So it's kind of a step around what Leslie was talking about, but it is us, the viewer, looking. So let's categorize this. Okay, so we have this guy who is a looker, this woman who is a looker and she's being looked at, and we, as the viewers, are looking at all of it, right? We're able to see all of it. Well, maybe not all of it, not everything, but we're seeing out, okay? Yeah, so great. Just wanted to say that there are different types of viewers. And, those who look, I'm going to break it into two categories. Those who look, maybe they're the voyeurs, and those who are looked at. Okay. And I also wanted to talk about how kind of traditionally, the people who look tend to be male. They tend to be, at least in the Western world, white and at least middle class, right? So these are the artists. This is the kind of the people who are looking, or they're the artists, right? That Leslie's position of, I'm going to create this view of looking at. And the people who are being looked at tend to be women, right? And so if you want to just say it, I mean, this is kind of a reductionist, but if you think about it, here's a good way if you wanted to challenge that. Like, I don't know if I totally agree with that. If you think about the 19th century, how many times are you probably going to see a naked man stretched out on a couch, right? So there's this location of the body, the feminine body, that is to be looked at by what is called, essentially, I'm gonna jump the gun a little bit here, but what's called the male gaze. And so I'm going to discuss that a little bit further. I might have brought this up in class, but as you all know, I love to bring in kind of the stuff in academia that graduate students and professors talk about right in here. But it's a type of looking, and it has tended to be genderized, okay? So just throwing that out there as we look, right? So what if we were talking about this? So we have these two roles, right? Those who look and those who are looked at. In the first role, this sort of looking, the looker, what are the kinds of looking that might be there, right? There's the looking, you could be looking as the artist at literally what you are seeing. So in this right now, we're looking at a Cassatt painting that depicts two women having tea, right? On a couch in what looks like to be the sitting room, right? And then we've got this tea set. So this is the kind of content, the material content that is being conveyed. You might also see, as far as what you are looking at, like as the looker, you might just notice painting style, right? The way in which Cassatt has laid down the paint here, that you have chunks of obvious brushstrokes, right? She's not necessarily melding everywhere the paint together. And so this is an impressionist style, right? So again, this is something that you might catalog as in the role of the looker, okay? You might also categorize in the looking as the artist looker, or perhaps as the viewer, the way in which the painting is set up for us. So composition. So are we coming in really tight, or is this a broad view? Where are we standing? Where does the artist put us? Are we standing next to? Are we above? Are we floating in the air? Are we below? All these kinds of things, right? Composition and perspective. So how zoomed in we are, how zoomed out we are, where the figure is on the canvas in this case, right? So these are these kinds of things, and perspective. I'd like to kind of zero in on this. This is the kind of how I'm seeing, right? As opposed to necessarily what I'm seeing. And the paintbrush strokes, the style, it can actually fit in both categories. It helps with the how, and it also is literally what I'm seeing, right? But I'm interested in us kind of knocking over into the composition perspective, this way in which the artist has communicated the subject matter. And particularly, I wanted to demonstrate this in the way that women artists were doing this versus, or in addition to, what male artists were doing, and kind of buy into, at least for the moment, this idea of this kind of binary, right? And I'm hopefully going to have time to break it down. Actually, it's not that simple, as I'm sure you all are guessing, right? But part of the reason I want to do this is, again, I'm thinking about this class as being an equipper for you. And so a lot of the paintings that you will see, especially when you go to the Louvre and look at sort of the more traditional paintings, you're going to see something. Okay, so sorry about this. The idea is, what are some of the other options for looking and seeing things, artwork, that are different from the Louvre, right? Or that might be different from if you go to the Musée d'Orsay, which is a lot of 19th century and modern art, but it's still dominated by this male perspective, right? And so there is a way in which when you find out, well, what are some of our other options that help you not only expand your view of whatever the art is at the time and the world was at the time, but it interestingly, because it's saying from a different point of view, so right now, again, I'm reducing it down to these women who have a particular perspective because of their social class and gender, and the way that they're creating something that then reflects back on, oh, I never noticed, for instance, this idea that women's bodies are sort of almost being served up to us, right? And this goes way, way, way back. So even if you don't look at modern art and you're just walking around, the Louvre, and I don't know if this Titian is actually in the Louvre, I should have looked, but you're going to see work like this, right? Where a woman's body is being sort of offered up to you. And when we're looking at how women, their perspective, and again, this is kind of across the board heterosexuality, right? So the way that women are looking, they are not necessarily going to portray other women in this way. And so a lot of this by this one scholar who I'm really, really looking at and going to convey some of just her brilliance, is arguing that really it has to do with this composition and perspective that's going to show a lot of the way in which they created something that is slightly other or in addition to the men. And I just really think, of course, people are not going to talk when you're standing in front of a painting. Well, this is what these other folks are doing, right? You're going to really focus in on that. So I wanted to give you all this so that you could do that. Does that make sense? It's like, if you get a comparison, it helps you actually understand the thing you're originally looking at. Yeah, thumbs up. Does that make sense? Okay, great. So this is kind of going back to what I was trying to say. This is the punchline, okay? And we're going to break it down a little bit more. But that an artist's identity, however it's carved out by society, and then their place in society. So we're going to see at this time period, man and woman, right? In today's society, that's not this binary is not necessarily what everybody uses, right? So, but society has helped carve that out, right? As far as gender roles, same thing with class. All these things are going to affect the way that you look. For those of you who are like, I mean, kind of duh, right? Like, obviously, I'm sure that that's going to inflect it. But the question then is, yeah, but exactly how? Can I see some examples? And so this is what I want for us to take a look at here. The idea of the male gaze. So this is a film scholar named Laurel Mulvey. And in the last century, she kind of brought up this idea that a lot of what we see visually in the Western Hemisphere and the history of the visual arts has been looked through a straight, so heterosexual male looking lens, right? Because most of the artists who have been in control of sort of setting the standards have been exactly that, and also white and middle class, at least middle class and above, right? So what is this? What is that sort of the male gaze? And for Laura Mulvey, and again, this sort of became an anchor to everyone in scholarship in the humanities, all the way to literature, right? So even though they're not using their eyeballs, that's how pervasive it became. And the idea was that the male gaze is kind of a consuming gaze, right? So the things that we are seeing are meant to be taken in. We get to own them with our eyeballs, right? So that's one thing. Another characteristic of the male gaze is that you can have detachment, that there is this sort of looking at. Because I'm a consumer, I'm looking at, so I can be a voyeur, I can be a participant if I want to in kind of mastery of this. I can be the all-knowing, I see everything, right? I can see all the things that are happening there that maybe some of the figures are not seeing themselves, right? Let's see, what else do I have here? Right. I'm also showing you, just to be fair, we have a male artist here. He's one of my favorites, who is actually complicating this male gaze. So oftentimes the gaze of the woman here who is being consumed, I mean, I just don't know how else to put it. She's kind of being served up by Titian as this sort of bonbon for our eyeballs to take in, right? And so what happens here is Manet is actually giving her the look straight on into the viewer. So there's a little bit more of a confrontation that's going on here. And I think what Manet is doing is complicating this, right? You can't just consume me without any kind of consequences or being seen yourself, right? You're not just the looker, you also get looked at. So I just wanted to kind of show that. The other thing that I wanted to point out was, so then if that is what you might see when you walk through the Louvre as a dominant way of seeing and looking, the way things are composed, the perspective, so on and so forth, what is chosen, right, as subject matter? Because again, I think we would immediately, if you've walked through a lot of museums, you would not see male figures doing this, right? So what is happening here with women who are artists? And so we're going to focus on two particular artists in the Impressionist period who are adding to our vocabulary of seeing, ways of seeing. Okay, and so this scholar named Griselda Pollock, she wrote this kind of groundbreaking article called Modernity and the Spaces of Femininity. And I'm drawing really heavily from this because I just think it's really brilliant. But basically, one of the things that she says marks these two artists, I'm going to show you Cassatt and a woman named Berthe Meursault, who is a French woman, and they were colleagues. And she notices proximity and what is her really great word, and compression. So the ways of looking are proximity and compression. So if you notice here, proximity, we are really tight up towards the figure, right? We're really up close. And the other things are being kind of carved out. We don't know, is there another seat here, right? What else does this living room look like? Right? Same here, right? We're really close up into the figures. And again, just that side note, look at all the looking that's being involved here, right? And the ways in which the looking is reflected back to us literally. So again, this is very conscious. These artists are really thinking about these kinds of things consciously. This is Meursault, again, a French artist. And we're seeing here the proximity, but also this way in which she's being compressed towards us, right? Even such that she's got this kind of barrier pulling us towards her, right? Or vice versa, pulling her towards us. She's kind of pulled in and not separate from us. I'll show you another example of this. So here we've got maybe a wider expanse, and yet the woman who is figured here is pressed up against the right side of this canvas, right? And being pushed up even more so by this wall. And we are on that side of the wall, right? So the question is, and maybe I'll give you one more example here, right? So here we are on the balcony. Again, another balcony. And yes, we are seeing into this wider expanse. And yes, it is kind of semi-public, so we can't even name it like, okay, only the guys are painting the stuff outside, right, in public. This is actually not true. We've seen some examples already, and we started off this time with a public example. But I really do think Pollock is really onto something here with this idea of kind of the nearness and this idea of being able to have a certain different kind of connection with the figures who are in the painting. In the past, scholars and viewers have really paid attention to the idea of these women artists are, quote unquote, only painting domestic scenes, right? That women are only interested in these kinds of things. And if we look at some of the paintings that are here, certainly those things are there, but is that the answer? Is it just because women particularly are interested in those spheres, right? As though there is some sort of biological imperative, right? And I obviously would like to question that right here. So see, we're looking at all three, and I'm going to throw this out there. Oh my gosh, I can't believe we're almost out of time. But here we are. I'm going to go a little bit longer, y'all. If you need to drop off, I hope you'll join the class, but I'm just going to keep rolling. I've missed you all, and I'm getting into this. Are there things that you all notice here that is kind of different than some of the paintings that you've seen by men? And maybe actually, you know what? Let me give us examples. So here we've got some more, right? Again, but this is by Cassatt. And we've got that proximity again and compression. And let me give you another example. So this is done by Monet, right? So we've got this other perspective, right? This kind of bird's eye view that is open to us as the viewer. We get to look over all of this, right? It's almost as though here we're sort of in Versailles. This would be where the king would look over, right, at the garden. And look at this. It's even open to us, right? We can walk right into this pathway. We can walk right into this road. But it's this sort of not relational to the figure's point of view, right? And Monet doesn't only do this kind of thing, but you are not going to see as much of this by these women painters that we just saw. And by the way, if we're tempted to say, oh gosh, it's again, I'm thinking about the social spheres. So gosh, what are these women? What do they have access to? Well, okay, it's the domestic sphere, right? Or these places, right? This is public. It's very much seen. I mean, you're going out there to be seen, right? This is when you want to bring in another complication, which is to say it's also about class, right? So whereas these middle class artists, they're middle and upper class artists, Cassatt and Marceau, are painting the spheres that are open to them as proper, quote unquote, middle class or upper middle class women, right? They are defined by their gender and also by their class. Whereas we're looking here at a barmaid who is a woman, and she is in a public space that these women are not painting, that Cassatt is not painting, right? So here we have women, but they are of a different class, right? So this is one of those things where it's a little bit tricky to say, okay, the male sphere is public, right? And the female sphere is, private, or the women are only interested in the domestic and only the men are only interested in the public. And that's just, it doesn't quite work that way, right? So I think what we want to do, okay, I'm not going to go too much over, but if you all wouldn't mind, and you can tell me what slide you want to go to, are there other things that you're noticing about the women's artists' perspective in the way that they're committing to you all being able to see what they want you to see? There are some characteristics you want to throw in there. So we've had proximity and compression being a way to do it. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what Pollock ends up saying is the reasoning why she thinks that it creates this different kind of relationship. Are there things you can, okay, we've got someone on the chat, but feel free to also unmute yourself.
I think
There is more touch between the subjects. Okay, that's interesting. You mean they're closer up. Thank you, Bonnie. There are multiple mirrors. That's interesting. Yeah, the guys will also show it. I mean, of course, it's hard to, Monet doesn't represent all men, right? The faces are more detailed than the surroundings. That's interesting. Yeah, Sue. The situations seem more ordinary for the women, quote unquote, right? This kind of banality to it, right? Or what we would, yeah, great. Thank you. Anyone else?
Yes. I'm typing, but I can talk quicker.
Great.
And I noticed that oftentimes the women are observing what is going on in the paintings, and as opposed to participating in what is going on.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Are you talking about that it's also in this for the women as well?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
This is Leo. I'm looking at them, and it's the colors, especially in these three photos. The colors, I think, really add to the strength of the painting.
How would you describe the colors for us, Leo?
Well, they're bright. They're so that brings out the emotional part as bright as well.
Okay. All right. So they're really bright. And again, I just want to say, I didn't show all the other paintings, but yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. What is everybody? Liz is saying women artists do not have subject looking at the viewer. Hey, Liz, do you mind hopping on? I don't know that I fully understood that. And in the
Well,
meantime-
in the men's artists, they're looking directly at us, like, you know, you've got to own that you're looking at me. Whereas the women's artists that you're showing us, they're just doing what they're doing. They're not engaged with the viewer of the painting.
Yeah.
They're engaged in their activity.
Yep, with the activity and sometimes with one another. Of course, I've shown you this. Like I always love that. I feel like the line underneath this should go awkward, right? Okay, let me see. Thanks, Liz, for jumping in. I'm so glad you clarified. So Sue was saying, however, there is Artemisia Gentileschi, right? Not homey in ordinary scenes. Absolutely. So this is a Baroque painter. So these are sort of the exceptions. But notice, Sue, she got in. Right? She got in. So she's using this language that has been decidedly, again, male. And, you know, the danger here in a 30-minute lecture is to make it sound like women talk like this, men talk like this. And I think instead what we should say is human beings put in this particular situation with this particular body have this particular sphere that is access to them, and might then have a perspective on that they want to communicate, right? So just to make that clear, it's not like women pop out of the womb and this is what they're doing. Scenes, not signs. Eloise, do you mind hopping in and tell me a little bit more about that? What do you mean by that?
About a snapshot in time.
I see.
Yeah, I mean, this woman, just at the moment she has her teacup to her mouth, that's the picture you're getting. And then the little girl looking in the mirror. I mean, she's probably not holding it there for 10 minutes,
Right.
but for that moment.
Right.
So it's it's showing a particular activity. We're not trying to show what a woman looks like. We're just showing an activity.
That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. So you all are really noticing. Thank you all for jumping in. I always want to include you all, even in these half-hour, supposedly, lectures, right? Is that what at least Pollock is saying here is that she's arguing that by coming in close as the viewer, right, as this kind of looker, you are at some level forced, quote unquote, to participate, and your participation is not as this overseer who sees all the things, right? You are instead ground level. You are with these folks. And again, I showed you the Renoir where, you know, they're in this park and it's this whole busyness and you are kind of part of the scene, right? But in this, it is close cropped. You are absolutely close in, and it mimics a little bit more of what you would see if you were actually participating. Right? If you were actually sitting there as another human being who is in relationship with these sitters, right? So it's actually even the angle and the composition in which you are painting, right? And so it's just very curious that these women who have very similar situations socioeconomically and also by their gender, that they're noticing these particular things, right? That is different than these other human beings who have other access. And so I also want to say, I've used in my language before that, oh gosh, it seems like they're limited to these spheres. And really it's because I've defined the world in another sphere that's been trained by this male gaze. Right? So there is another way in which human beings in another situation can also look at the world. So one, visual or perspective that we're not looking at, right? What about someone who is of a lower economic class? How might they paint this world? So these are the kinds of things that I wanted to show to us that we can kind of keep in mind when we're looking at paintings. So for instance, say you came across this painting by, again, my favorite, Manet, and look at the kinds of ways in which the balcony and people standing on the balcony are standing. So the questions here that you might walk around with in your fanny pack, right, as opposed to just being bombarded by, okay, there's another painting, is asking, not only what is, oh, rats. Hello. Oops, sorry. Here I am. Sorry about that freezing, but that was very dramatic. The question you might ask yourself is not just what is being depicted, right? People on a balcony, or that they happen to be looking at us, but how is it being depicted, right? So it can be everything from brushstrokes to where you are as the viewer. Where has the artist placed you as the looker? What is your role? And this is something that I think is useful across the ages in Western art. Okay, so that's kind of my like goodie bag of handing this off to you. Things like, are you separate from these folks? Or are you right there with this woman? Right? Like these are some of the kinds of things I would just love for you to pay attention to. Just note, I'd rather see your faces, so I'm going to pull down the slideshow, but just note that we are going to start this class next week. And because I didn't give you all a bunch of time and because you all are world travelers, a bunch of you are going to be missing parts of it. And I wanted to just say, even if you can stay for only an hour and you just want to watch the rest of the recording, please do that as well. I don't know how many classes I'm going to be doing. It's going to be slower than in the past, I think. So I just wanted to give a heads up to that. The other thing that is really this beautiful addition to this course is that Dr. Kelly McGill has agreed to jump on with us twice for about a half an hour for us to ask her tips or, hey, I'm going to go look at the Parthenon. Is that close enough for me to see X? You can ask her those things. You can ask her, which I'm going to do, what if I'm bored at looking at all the churches? What do you suggest I do when I'm trapped with this tour? Right? And she had this great answer to that. So those are the kinds of things that you can ask her. And when we do Rome, we'll ask her about Rome. When we do Florence, we'll ask her about Florence. Okay, so it's a real treat. And the other two times you're stuck with me to be asking kind of Q&A stuff.